A thick mist curled along the edge of the sleepy veterinary clinic. Inside, an old wooden door opened to reveal a small waiting room with faded linoleum and a single flickering lamp. Mara, a compassionate veterinarian, stood alone behind a narrow counter. The clock struck 6 in the evening, and the last sliver of daylight slipped away. Outside, the silhouette of a timid pregnant dog lingered near the doorway. She was thin, coat matted, tail tucked. Mara's gentle heart stirred. Just as she brushed aside her fatigue, the dog shuffled closer, eyes filled with urgency. A young man in torn jeans and a worn jacket hovered behind the dog, voice trembling. He pleaded for help, saying the dog had been injured on the way, collapsing under the hot sun. Mara's mind raced. The clinic was already closed for the day. She thought of the paperwork, the risk of infection, the long night ahead. Hesitation clouded her face. Compassion warred with worry. She raised her voice softly, her words choked with exhaustion. She said she could not help tonight given policy, given her exhaustion, given how everything had already gone wrong this week. The young man's voice cracked. He begged, pressed, whispered that the dog was carrying life inside her, yet he could not bear to see her suffer. A distant rumble of thunder echoed as the dog whimpered softly, shifting from one paw to another. Mara's eyes flickered to the curving shadow across the wall. A sudden ringing of her phone shattered the quiet. She stepped back, torn between professional duty and emotional burnout. Outside, the fog thickened. Mara stared at the dog's trembling frame. The clock ticked. Time seemed to stretch. In that moment of hesitation, the dog lifted her head, ears perked toward Mara as if pleading. The world seemed to pause. Mara's resolve sang in discord with her conscience. She drew a slow breath, her heart pounding. She closed her eyes and shook her head. She repeated softly that she could not treat her tonight. The door closed behind her as she moved toward the phone. A heavy silence settled. The young man sank to his knees. The dog let out a soft, forlorn moan. In the hallway beyond, light flickered and drew the outline of something unexpected, a familiar collar, a quiet tag that bore a forgotten name in silvery letters. Mara's hand froze mid-raise, phone forgot in her palm. The name teased a memory she could not yet fully summon. Chapter 1 ends with her eyes fixed on that tag, haunted by recognition, anticipation thin as mist around them. The faint glimmer of the silver tag swung gently beneath the dog's neck, catching the glow of the flickering lamp. Mara's breath caught in her throat as she leaned closer. The inscription was scratched yet still legible, etched with quiet determination against the passing years. The name read Leora. Mara's fingers trembled. Leora. The word struck her chest like a ghost from her past. She whispered it under her breath, as though speaking it aloud might summon memories she had carefully locked away. Her eyes grew distant, unfocused, recalling a field of daisies long ago, where a playful pup with bright eyes had once leapt into her arms. But that was impossible. Leora had vanished years earlier, swept away during a storm. Mara had mourned, buried the grief, and forced herself to move forward. Yet here stood this fragile dog, pregnant and weary, bearing that same name, carrying the same spark in her eyes. Could it be her? Mara pressed her palm against her chest, feeling her heartbeat pound. The young man noticed Mara's frozen stance, and asked if something was wrong. His voice trembled, worried she would once again refuse. Mara did not answer him. Instead she crouched, ignoring the ache in her knees, and reached out a hand. Leora's nose brushed her fingertips with hesitant recognition. The warmth of the touch nearly broke Mara's resolve. Still, the weight of exhaustion and rules pressed heavily on her shoulders. She stood abruptly, breaking the contact. Her voice, strained and uncertain, repeated her refusal. She claimed it was not possible to reopen the clinic, that she had no staff left, that the resources were already thin. The young man's face collapsed into despair. Thunder roared again outside, this time louder, rattling the windows. The storm that had loomed on the horizon drew closer, and in its wake the shadows deepened. Leora whimpered, lowering herself carefully onto the cold floor, her swollen belly contracting in waves that spoke of urgency. Mara's hand lingered on the counter, nails digging into the wood. Her mind swirled between the ghost of her lost companion and the reality before her. Lightning split the sky, flooding the room with stark white light. In that fleeting illumination, Mara saw the young man's eyes brimming with tears, saw the dog's body quiver with effort, and felt the cruel weight of her own hesitation. The storm outside was no longer waiting. Nor was Leora. The first raindrops slapped against the clinic's glass like impatient fingers demanding entry. Within minutes the sky released its fury, sheets of water hammering down, thunder booming in rhythm with the dog's labored breathing. The clinic seemed smaller, walls closing in with each strike of lightning that bled through the windows. Mara stood motionless, her hand still pressed to the counter. Every instinct told her to act, yet fear whispered of failure, of the risks, of the endless weight she already carried. Leora's soft cries sliced through the storm's roar, trembling sounds that wove threads of guilt around Mara's heart. The young man knelt beside Leora, stroking her damp fur with trembling fingers. His voice cracked as he murmured comfort. He looked up once more, eyes red, pleading without words. The silence that hung between them was heavier than thunder, a silence thick with despair and demand. Mara turned her gaze toward the far corner of the clinic, where an old wooden cabinet stood. Inside lay the tools she had not touched in years, equipment stained with memories of long nights and desperate battles for fragile lives. Her chest tightened. She had promised herself she would not walk that path again, not since the night she had lost her first patient under the weight of her inexperience. A violent gust shook the windows. Rain forced its way through a thin crack, dripping onto the floor like a ticking clock, each drop a reminder of slipping time. Leora's body convulsed, a shudder rolling through her as another contraction seized her frame. Her whimper deepened into a low cry. Mara's breath faltered. She felt the storm pulling her inward, pressing her to choose. She stepped toward Leora, then stopped, trapped in the echo of that old failure. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Suddenly, lightning illuminated the room, striking so close that the walls trembled. In that harsh white glare Mara saw Leora's eyes fixed on her. Eyes she remembered. Eyes that once chased butterflies in sunlit fields. Eyes that now begged for salvation. Mara's chest tightened until it ached. She felt something shift within her, fragile yet unyielding, like a dam ready to break. But still she hesitated, her hand hovering in the storm-chilled air, caught between the shadow of her fear and the fragile pulse of hope trembling before her. The storm raged louder, as if the heavens themselves demanded her decision. The clinic shuddered as the storm pressed against its walls. Water streamed down the windows, distorting the shapes of the outside world into twisted shadows. Inside, the smell of rain mixed with the sharp scent of antiseptic that lingered from long-forgotten days. Mara's pulse hammered in her ears as she stood above Leora, her fingers trembling, her breath uneven. She remembered a promise once spoken beneath the sky of her childhood. She had been only a girl, cradling a wounded puppy in her arms, whispering that she would always protect the innocent, that she would fight for every fragile life given by Allah. Those words, once pure and certain, now echoed hollow inside her chest. Time had worn them thin, replaced them with fear, rules, exhaustion. But the dog before her, Leora, was not just a patient. She was the ghost of that promise, a mirror of Mara's heart. Leora's body heaved, her breath shallow, her eyes glazed with exhaustion yet refusing to close. The young man beside her pressed his forehead against her fur, whispering words too soft to catch. Tears slipped silently from his eyes. Mara's hand brushed against the cabinet. The key rested cold in her palm, the very key she had vowed never to use again. She closed her eyes and saw that night years ago, the small body she could not save, the lifeless stillness that had scarred her soul. It had been the night she nearly abandoned her oath, the night she promised never to face such pain again. Thunder cracked above, shaking the very foundations of the clinic. The storm seemed alive, urging her forward, daring her to fulfill or betray that forgotten vow. Mara's knuckles whitened as she gripped the key tighter. She turned slowly toward the cabinet, the metal squealing as the lock gave way. Dust rose into the air as she pulled the doors open. Inside lay the instruments of her past. Worn scissors, faded gauze, syringes that gleamed faintly under the trembling light. Her chest rose and fell, each breath a battle. Behind her, Leora whimpered again, the sound sharper, more urgent. Mara flinched. She reached into the cabinet, her hand hovering just above the tools. Her mind screamed of risks, of memories, of the line she had drawn. But the storm, the cries, the pleading eyes of Leora pulled her hand closer. The young man looked up then, his voice low but steady. He said only 3 words, "Save her, please." And in that moment Mara felt the full weight of the storm collapse inward, forcing her to decide whether her promise would remain a memory or rise again as her truth. The lamp above the counter buzzed weakly, casting fractured shadows across the room. Mara's hands shook as she laid the tools on a faded cloth, her breath sharp in her chest. Each metallic sound of steel against wood echoed like a drumbeat of fate. She knelt beside Leora, heart pounding, sweat mixing with the damp chill from the storm. Leora's body shivered, her sides tightening as another contraction rippled through her. The young man clutched her paw gently, whispering prayers beneath his breath. His eyes flicked to Mara, a silent question burning in their depths. Mara pressed her stethoscope against Leora's chest, the faint rhythm of her heart fighting against exhaustion. For a moment fear nearly overtook her. Her vision blurred with memory, blood on her gloves, a body growing still, her hands trembling as a life slipped away. She almost pulled back. But then Leora's eyes met hers. Not with fear, not with doubt, but with a fragile trust that pierced through every layer of Mara's hesitation. Her throat tightened. She whispered to herself that this time would be different, that Allah had brought this creature back to her not to break her, but to mend her. Her scalpel hovered above trembling flesh. Lightning flared through the window, white and merciless, illuminating the room like a theater stage. The storm's roar muffled the sound of her blade pressing down, the first cut of courage splitting silence with defiance. The young man gasped softly, tears filling his eyes. Mara's movements were precise, every gesture a war against her shaking nerves. Blood welled, the smell sharp, the urgency heavier. She worked quickly, her voice barely audible as she guided herself step by step, repeating the words she once heard from her mentor long ago. Steady, breathe, trust the life before you. Outside, thunder boomed again, but Mara no longer heard it. Her focus narrowed to the fragile life beneath her hands, to the heartbeat that faltered yet refused to stop. Time blurred. Moments stretched into an eternity of trembling steel and whispered prayers. Mara's hair clung to her damp forehead, sweat dripping into her eyes. Still, she pressed on, unwilling to surrender to the weight of fear. Then, a sound broke the silence, soft, fragile, but undeniable. The first whimper of new life echoing into the storm. Mara froze, her scalpel falling still in her hand. Her heart stopped as she stared at what had emerged beneath her trembling fingers. The room hung in silence for a breathless instant. Rain pounded against the windows, thunder cracked above, and then it came again, the faint, trembling cry of a newborn. It pierced the storm like a fragile flame flickering in the dark. Mara's eyes widened, her hands frozen in midair. The young man gasped, covering his mouth with both hands as tears spilled freely. On the cloth beneath Mara's trembling fingers, a small pup struggled for air, its wet fur clinging to its tiny frame. Mara's training surged back like a river breaking its dam. She moved swiftly now, rubbing the newborn with clean gauze, clearing its airway, coaxing its lungs to fill with the first breath of life. The pup whimpered louder, tiny legs kicking, voice growing stronger with each second. The young man laughed through his tears, whispering praise, whispering gratitude. He leaned close, watching the miracle unfold, though his gaze never left Leora, whose body still shook with the strain of labor. Mara glanced at her, heart pounding anew. Leora's eyes, heavy with pain, held onto her with a glimmer of trust. Another contraction rippled through her, stronger this time, her breath sharp and uneven. Mara knew it was not over, not yet. She steadied herself, laying the first pup gently in a small towel-lined basket near the counter. Its cries filled the clinic, soft yet powerful, a chorus of defiance against the storm. She turned back to Leora, hands steadying, voice firm. She whispered encouragement, as if her words alone could guide Leora through. Lightning flared again, filling the room with stark white. Mara's shadow stretched across the wall, tall and unwavering, as though the storm itself bore witness to her return to courage. She reached for her instruments, preparing for the next wave. Another cry began to rise, from Leora this time, deeper, urgent, pulling Mara's heart tight. The young man pressed closer, whispering to Leora that she was not alone. Mara leaned in, sweat dripping from her brow, whispering too, not only to Leora but to herself, that she would not fail again. Then, just as the thunder roared louder than before, a second whimper filled the room. Another fragile cry joined the first, and the clinic bloomed with the sound of life defying the storm. Mara's hands shook, not from fear now, but from awe. She stared at the two tiny creatures, at Leora's trembling chest, and felt something within her begin to heal. The cries of the two newborn pups echoed against the clinic walls, fragile melodies that seemed to hold back the darkness outside. Yet amidst that chorus of life, Mara's eyes narrowed. Something was wrong. Leora's breathing had grown shallow, her chest rising unevenly, her strength fading too quickly. The young man noticed it as well. His voice shook as he asked if she would survive, but Mara could not answer. Her hands pressed gently along Leora's side, feeling the tension of another life still waiting to emerge. Exhaustion had taken its toll. Leora's eyes fluttered closed, then opened again with effort, shimmering with both pain and trust. Mara's throat tightened. She remembered the night years ago when another animal had lain before her in this very position, when her inexperience had cost more than she could bear. The memory clawed at her, demanding she give in to fear. But the whimpers of the newborn pups pulled her back, anchoring her in the present. The storm raged louder, as though the heavens tested her resolve. Mara leaned close, whispering words of strength to Leora, telling her she was not alone. She pressed her palms against the dog's trembling body, willing her to hold on. With a deep breath, Mara reached for the tools once more. The young man knelt opposite her, his hand resting on Leora's paw, his lips moving in silent prayer. Mara's hands moved quickly but gently, guiding, coaxing, fighting against time. Minutes stretched into eternity. Every second felt like a battle balanced on the edge of silence. Leora gasped, her body shuddering with the strain. Mara urged her onward, her own voice shaking as she pleaded not with fear but with determination. Then, through the storm's thunder and the pounding of her heart, another cry broke free. Weak at first, then stronger. A third pup had entered the world. Relief surged through Mara, but it was fleeting. Leora's body sagged, her breath shallow, her eyes half closed. The life of the mother now trembled as precariously as the storm-battered branches outside. Mara's hands hovered, torn between tending to the fragile newborn or fighting for the strength of the mother. The young man's voice rose, desperate, calling Mara's name, begging her to choose quickly. And in that charged moment, as the storm roared and silence threatened, Mara realized she stood once again on the edge she had always feared, the place where life and death waited for her hand. Rain lashed harder against the clinic walls, the storm clawing as if to force its way inside. The newborn pups whimpered softly from the basket, their tiny voices fragile against the roar of thunder. Mara's hands trembled over Leora's chest, feeling the shallow rhythm that faltered with each breath. The young man's voice cracked. He begged her to save Leora, his words spilling out like a prayer broken by fear. Mara pressed her ear close, listening for the fragile beat that still lingered beneath her trembling fingers. It was there, faint, unsteady, like a candle threatened by the wind. Her heart raced. The memory of failure tried once more to claim her, visions of cold silence, of lifeless bodies, of her own hands shaking in defeat. But she pushed it back, whispering fiercely that this time would not be the same. This time she would not surrender. She moved quickly, her hands steady despite the storm in her chest. She massaged Leora's ribs, breathed words of encouragement, urged her to fight. The young man followed her lead, holding Leora's paw, pressing his forehead against her fur, whispering that she was loved, that she was not alone. Seconds dragged. The storm roared. Leora's body went still for one terrifying heartbeat. The room froze, silence pressing heavy, unbearable. Mara's hands pressed harder, her voice rising in desperate command. She called Leora back, not as a vet, but as someone who once loved her, someone who still remembered her bounding through fields beneath the sun. For a moment it seemed lost. Then, faintly, a twitch, a shiver, a breath that staggered back into the room. Mara gasped, relief flooding her veins as the weak rhythm steadied, fragile yet alive. The young man broke into sobs, his shoulders shaking as he whispered gratitude. Mara closed her eyes, her own tears spilling freely, though her hands never left Leora's side. The storm outside bellowed in answer, as though even the sky acknowledged the fragile victory within those walls. But Mara knew it was not yet over. Leora had been pulled back from the edge, but her strength was threadbare, her body still trembling, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. Mara looked at the pups, their cries growing louder, demanding warmth, demanding their mother. Her chest tightened. She knew the battle was not yet won. She would have to fight harder still, for both mother and children, against time and the storm that threatened to take them all. And in the flicker of that moment, lightning lit the room and cast Mara's shadow tall and unyielding across the wall, the shadow of a woman no longer bound by fear, but standing at the fragile border between surrender and salvation. The storm outside showed no mercy. Lightning tore the sky apart while thunder rolled endlessly, shaking the windows of the small clinic. Yet inside, the true battle raged on the floor where Leora lay. Her breathing was shallow, her body trembling as though each moment drained the last of her strength. The pups cried from the basket, their tiny voices piercing, calling out for warmth they could not understand. The young man rushed to them, wrapping them gently in cloth, trying to quiet their cries, though his eyes never left their mother. Mara worked tirelessly. Her hands moved with precision, checking Leora's pulse, adjusting her position, coaxing her to fight. Sweat clung to Mara's temples, dripping into her eyes, but she did not blink it away. Every movement mattered, every breath was a thread she refused to let slip. Her heart ached as she remembered the days when Leora had been full of energy, chasing shadows, her tail a banner of joy. Those memories now clashed with the fragile form before her, fighting for every breath. Mara whispered her name again and again, as if the sound alone could tether her to life. The young man crouched beside them, his lips moving in whispers of prayer. Mara glanced at him once, reading the desperation etched in his face, and felt the weight of his hope pressing against her own. Hours stretched like an eternity. The storm battered on, but Mara no longer noticed. Time became nothing but the space between Leora's breaths. Sometimes it seemed she would slip away, her chest stalling, her pulse faltering. Each time Mara fought harder, refusing to let go. Then, as the night deepened, something shifted. Leora's breaths grew steadier, faint but determined. Her eyes, though clouded with exhaustion, opened just enough to meet Mara's gaze. In that fleeting moment there was recognition, as if she knew who stood beside her, as if the bond from years past had never been broken. Mara's throat tightened, her tears falling freely now. She whispered to her that she was safe, that she was home, that Allah had given them another chance. The young man exhaled a long, trembling breath, clutching the basket of pups to his chest as relief softened his face. Yet even in that fragile peace, Mara knew the night was not done. The battle had shifted, but the weight of it was far from over. The storm outside raged still, and inside, a fragile family clung to the thin thread between survival and loss, while Mara held fast, refusing to let the thread break. The storm finally began to tire, its thunder rolling farther away into the distance. Rain softened into a steady rhythm, tapping against the windows like a lullaby. In the quiet that followed, the small clinic felt different, less a place of fear, more a sanctuary carved out of the night. Mara sat slumped beside Leora, exhaustion painting deep lines across her face. Her gloves were stained, her hair clung damp against her cheeks, but her eyes never wavered from the fragile rise and fall of Leora's chest. Each breath was still a battle, but steadier now, no longer breaking apart in shallow gasps. The pups whimpered softly from their basket, squirming against one another, their tiny cries less desperate than before. The young man had wrapped them carefully in warm towels, his hands trembling from fatigue yet refusing to let go. Every so often his gaze would lift to Mara, filled with unspoken gratitude and hope. Mara reached out, brushing her fingers gently over Leora's ear. The dog stirred faintly, opening her eyes for just a moment. There, in that fleeting glance, Mara felt the echo of years gone by, the bond that had once tied them, the promise she had thought broken forever. Leora blinked slowly, as if in recognition, before sinking back into much-needed rest. Tears blurred Mara's vision. She turned away, drawing a ragged breath. For the first time in years, she felt the heavy stone of guilt shift within her chest. It did not vanish, but it cracked, letting through a fragile beam of light. The young man's voice broke the silence. He asked quietly if she thought Leora would make it. Mara did not answer at once. She looked to the pups, to the storm clouds thinning beyond the glass, to the first pale hue of dawn bleeding into the sky. Then she said softly that as long as Leora kept fighting, so would she. Outside, the first bird called tentatively into the morning, its song weak yet defiant against the remnants of the storm. The world beyond the clinic stirred back to life, while inside, the fragile family clung together, survivors of a night that had tested the very edges of hope. Mara leaned back against the wall, closing her eyes for a brief moment. Though exhaustion threatened to pull her under, she held fast to the sounds around her. The pups' cries, Leora's breaths, the rhythm of dawn. She knew the hardest hours were past, yet the journey ahead still loomed, uncertain, fragile. But for now, for this single breath of dawn, life had not been taken. It had been given. The forest seemed quieter than before, but silence in this cursed land was never a sign of peace. Every crunch of dried leaves beneath their boots echoed like a warning. Ethan led the group cautiously, his eyes scanning every shadow that flickered between the trees. Behind him, Sarah whispered, "It feels like something is following us." Her voice trembled, and she clutched the strap of her bag tighter. No one answered immediately. The air was heavy, almost pressing down on their shoulders. Daniel finally muttered, "We should stop for a moment. I don't like this feeling." Ethan raised a hand, signaling them to halt. They gathered in a small clearing, surrounded by twisted roots and fog that curled low to the ground. That's when they noticed, branches above them swayed though there was no wind. Suddenly, a faint rustle echoed, too heavy to be an animal. Then came a low growl, deep and guttural, vibrating through the trees. Sarah's eyes widened as a shadow darted just beyond the mist. "It's watching us," she whispered, fear choking her words. The growl grew louder, closer, circling them like a predator stalking its prey. The group instinctively formed a tight circle, backs pressed against one another. Ethan drew his knife, its blade trembling slightly in his grip. For a moment nothing moved. Then, from the darkness, two glowing eyes appeared, yellow, cold, and filled with malice. The shadows were no longer just tricks of the forest. They had taken form. The night had fallen heavy over the city, but the sky did not bring peace. Instead, it roared like a beast awakened, split apart by fire and thunder. The ground trembled as the last wave of destruction surged forward, consuming what little strength remained in Israel's defenses. Soldiers who once stood tall now cowered in the shadows, their weapons useless against the power unleashed upon them. The streets were littered with burning steel and broken stone, echoes of despair carried in the cries of those who fled with no destination. From every direction, the storm pressed in. Rockets rained from above, fire tore through the earth below, and the very air seemed to ignite with fury. No fortress could withstand it, no wall could hold it back. The heart of their nation cracked, and with it, the illusion of invincibility shattered forever. And in that chaos, silence grew louder than the explosions themselves. It was the silence of inevitability, of an ending that could no longer be stopped. The land that once boasted of strength and power now bowed to forces far beyond its grasp. As the flames consumed the horizon, the people realized the truth. No army, no weapon, no strategy could shield them from the wrath that had descended. What stood was not merely the fall of a nation, but the unveiling of a destiny written long before the fire touched the sky. The final stand was not marked by victory, but by surrender to the fate that had arrived.